I'm going to talk about dropped stitches and picking up drop stitches in particular. So I've got this swatch that has some seed stitch and some ribbing, and I'm going to just go ahead and in this ribbing section drop off one of these stitches. And for instance, it was in your knitting bag in the middle of a row, and the most recent stitch fell off, and because it was in your bag, it got tugged a little bit and, you know, jostled around. And when you picked up your knitting again, this is what you found, and you can tell it's not right. So what you want to do is, first of all, locate the stitch, the one that's still in stitch form, and you can see right there, that little bump is the stitch, and you shouldn't worry about it really. Just try to identify it. Once you have done this a couple of times, or even after you watch this video, you'll realize that it's nothing to panic about. You're going to know how to fix it here. So the stitch itself is a loop, and what you want to do is use a crochet hook or a tool like this. It's sort of like a double-ended crochet hook that's meant for just this purpose, for picking up drop stitches. And so when you find your loop or your stitch, you're going to kind of just pull it out either with your fingers if you can, or use a needle or your crochet hook to just kind of really form the stitch so you can really tell where the stitch is when you put your hook in there. Now you want to also be sure that the yarn that's making up that stitch, what's coming from the right side, is not getting twisted at the base of the stitch. So you can see this one's coming from the right side, it's coming right here, going around the hook in here, and then moving off to the left. So that's oriented in the right direction. Sometimes when you're picking up stitches, I'm going to pick it up backwards so you can see what I mean. If you pick it up this way and you take a look at the stitch, you can see that it's crossed at the bottom. You can see that the yarn from the left side is coming up over to the right and around the needle, and then moving off to the right. So you just want to be sure that your stitch is oriented on your repair hook or needle in the way that it's meant to be. So in this case, you want a not twisted stitch here. Okay, so I'm going to pull this down for a moment, and so you can see now we've got these runners that are coming across from one side of your knitting to the other, and these are the pieces of yarn that were knitted until the stitch dropped through them. So what you want to do is stretch your work out so you can see the runners clearly. You can double check on the back to make sure that there aren't any that have kind of fallen and hiding back here. So once you're sure you've got all your runners visible to you, what you can do on a stockinette stitch section is just then use the hook to get the next row yarn, hook it on the needle, and pull it through the stitch that you had there. So that's one drop stitch picked up. If you do it flat this way and you put the hook underneath the runner and pull it through, your new stitch will be oriented on your hook correctly. If you were to go around the top of the runner and pull it through this way, your stitch would be twisted. So try to just do it in the way that is least, that is the most direct. So put your hook underneath the runner, hook it, and pull it through the stitch that was on your hook. And then there's one more runner, so I'm going to pull that one through. And then there's our stitch, and it's caught up to the other ones. So then I'm going to put it onto my needle, and you can again check that it's oriented in the right way. The yarn that's coming from the right side is not twisting over anything, it just goes over the hook, and then the yarn moves on to the left. Sometimes when you pick up a stitch, like this, the tension will be a little bit off because whatever tool you're using to pick up your stitches might be narrower than your knitting needles. In that case, you can kind of pull at it a little bit like this. You can manipulate the stitches by just sort of giving them a bump up, making them use a little bit more of that yarn that was making up the runners, and that it will sort of catch up in tension. And also when you block, it will help, and you can pay extra attention to that section. All right, so then on the other side of this swatch, several rows back, I intentionally dropped a stitch, and this has also happened where, you know, you've been working on a project and you're cruising along, and all of a sudden you see this little nub kind of hanging down here at your knitting, and it's actually a stitch that you dropped, didn't even notice that you dropped it, and you've started to work away from it, not even knowing that you have a drop stitch. Well, you can't really leave it like that, because if you leave this nub here, it will drop down further and you'll have a run all the way down to your cast on edge. So if you discover one of those, for the time being, until you are at a place where you can concentrate and work on picking it up, I would put in a safety pin or a scrap piece of yarn or a stitch marker like so, and just to hold on to that stitch so it doesn't run any further. And then when you get to the point where you can work on it, you take your marker out and repeat what we did before. You put your hook into the stitch, double check that it's oriented flat, not twisted, and then the runners in this case are not going to be as obvious, but they are there. And so this method, you stretch out the stitches on either side of the stitch that was meant to be dropped, and you can see these runners back here. They're crowded, but they are here. There's all along this needle. It might be a little easier to see. So there's definitely not as much yarn as there was before in the other demonstration. So this time, the tension is going to be much different as you do this. Again, you want to make sure you get each one. So you're going to pull the runners through and you can catch it up. Now, you're going to notice that your tension in this row that you're picking up is going to be tight, and it's going to start to affect the tension of the stitches next to it. So in this case, you might want to, you're going to need to make a decision about if you can live with the way the new tension of these rows of stitches looks. You might decide that it's worth it to, you know, unknit your knitting all the way down to that where the drop stitch was, so that your stitches on either side can be all uniform, because you can see where this was all kind of nice and wide and relaxed. I've used some yarn from the stitches next door to repair the drop stitch column, but they've all now become pretty tight in here. So you can kind of see how it just kind of gradually goes in, kind of like a bottle shape right there. So there's that. So once you've got that stitch like this, you can work your way over to where that stitch belongs and then put it back on the needle and knit it as usual. So there's that option for repairing that. So on some projects, it might not matter so much that your tension changes, but on some projects you might decide that you want to just take your knitting out back to where you discovered the drop stitch and re-knit from there on. On the back side, you can see we've used all the runners, and that's even a little tight there too, up here. All right, that. And then the last one that I want to show you, I'm just going to let that drop again because I want to show you something over here in the seed stitch section. So in this seed stitch section over here, again, that scenario where you put your knitting down in the middle of a row and the recent stitch popped itself off of your needle and it's dropped down a little bit. I'm going to go down, let it drop a couple of rows. So on seed stitch, what you need to do is, again, find your stitch right there and take your hook, your repairing hook, and catch the stitch that you want. Now, you can tell by looking at this stitch, it has the wrapper right here. That means that it was a purl stitch. So the next stitch that I want to use these runners for needs to be a knit stitch. So that one is just like I showed you before. You put the needle under here and you hook the runner and pull it through. So we've got a knit stitch now. There's no turtleneck on this one. All right, but then because this is seed stitch and we want to alternate now to a purl stitch, what you need to do is get your yarn in front of your hook. Now this tool has a hook on both sides, so what you can do is slide the yarn. So now it's on top, the runner is on top of my hook, and because I can use the hook on the other end, I just do this. So now I've got the hook from this end up here by my stitch. I'm gonna duck under here. I've got my yarn in front. Now I'm going to grab the yarn, hook it, pull it through that stitch, and now I've made a purl. Right here you can see the turtleneck. And then, because the next one I want to do a knit on my seed stitch, I'm going to use the other end of my hook, go underneath the runner, hook the runner, and pull it through. So now I've got a knit stitch here. There's nice and flat, no turtleneck on this one. And then put it back on my needle, and away I go. Now, if you are going to use a crochet hook for that same scenario, let me drop down here, lose my stitch. A regular crochet hook won't have that benefit of being able to just slide your needle, your hook, down to the other end. So again, I have my purl stitch on my hook. I'm going to need a knit stitch next. So I'm going to put my needle or my hook under here, hook it, and pull it through. But this next runner and this next stitch need to be worked as a purl. So what I need to do is hold on to this stitch with my fingers. I'm sort of pinching the base of it, pull the hook out, and then come from behind. So I want to get the runner, the next runner, and the stitch on my hook, bring the yarn to the front, just like I was going to purl, and then hook the yarn of the runner and pull it through here. So now I've got a purl stitch on here. Then, again, I'm going to pinch the base of this stitch, take my hook out, put it back in from the front, leave my runner in the back, hook it, and pull it through, and put it back on my needle. Ready to go. Oops, don't panic. Just put those back in. Okay, and so those are the ways that you can fix a drop stitch.